case that shocked Indonesia in 2003.
In 2003, residents of a small village in central Java began noticing something unusual. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a shadow. It was a change. At a gravesite. At first it seemed minor. But when the truth came to light, an entire nation fell silent. This is the case of Sumanto, one of the most disturbing criminal cases in modern Indonesian history. The village was quiet. People lived simple lives. Religion and tradition shaped everyday routines. In communities like this, a grave is sacred. It represents respect, final rest, honor. That's why when villagers noticed signs that a burial site had been disturbed, fear began to spread. The soil looked uneven. There were unusual marks. Authorities were called. And soon the investigation led to one name, Sumanto.
Yep. Sumanto.
He was not known as a violent man. He wasn't powerful. He wasn't influential. He lived a modest and somewhat isolated life. But during questioning, he made an admission that stunned investigators. What he had done crossed not only legal boundaries, but deep cultural and moral lines. Within days, the story spread across Indonesia. News stations covered it nightly. Newspapers ran headlines that shocked readers nationwide. Indonesia is a country with strong spiritual and cultural values. For many, this case was more than a crime. It was a violation of something sacred. Public outrage mixed with disbelief. How could something like this happen in a religious, tradition-driven community? The village became the center of intense media attention. Cameras arrived, reporters searched for answers. But the questions only grew larger. Why would someone do this? Was it driven by belief, by mental instability, by poverty and social isolation? Some reports suggested that Sumanto believed certain spiritual practices could bring him power or fortune. Others argued that deeper psychological issues may have played a role. The case sparked uncomfortable conversations about mental health, superstition, and vulnerability in rural communities. Yet even today, no explanation fully satisfies everyone. Sumanto was arrested and brought to trial. The courtroom was filled with journalists. The public followed every development closely. He was ultimately convicted under Indonesian law and sentenced to prison. Legally, the case was closed, but socially, the impact lingered. After serving his sentence, reintegration proved difficult. His name had become synonymous with one of the most controversial crimes in the country's history. For many Indonesians, the memory of 2003 remains unsettling, not just because of what happened, but because it challenged assumptions about safety, belief, and human behavior. The story of Sumanto is not simply about crime. It is about isolation, belief, mental health, and how communities react when their deepest values are shaken. Outside Indonesia, this case is rarely discussed. But in 2003, it shocked an entire nation, and it continues to raise difficult questions about the darker corners of human nature. But beyond the headlines, there were deeper questions. Cases like this don't happen in isolation. They emerge from layers of social pressure, belief systems, economic hardship, and psychological vulnerability. In rural communities, discussions about mental health were, and in many places still are, limited. Support systems are often informal. And when someone begins to withdraw from society, the warning signs can easily go unnoticed. In the early 2000s, many parts of rural Indonesia were still struggling economically. Opportunities were limited. Education about mental health was rare. Isolation was common. For some individuals, isolation can quietly grow into something darker. Not violence at first, but detachment, and detachment can distort judgment. There were also reports suggesting that certain traditional beliefs may have influenced his actions. Across many cultures, not just in Indonesia, spiritual myths about gaining power or fortune have existed for generations. Most people never act on such beliefs, but in rare cases, when vulnerability meets superstition, the outcome can be tragic. When the story broke, it did more than shock the nation. It created fear, it created stigma, and it turned one man's crime into a symbol that would follow him for the rest of his life. For years after his release, communities struggled with one question: can someone truly return to society after committing an act that deeply violates cultural values? The case of Sumanto forces uncomfortable reflection, not only about crime, but about prevention, about how communities identify vulnerability, about how belief, poverty, and mental health intersect, and about how society chooses to respond after the headlines fade. Because long after the media moved on, the village remained, the memories remained, and the questions never fully disappeared. It is easy to reduce this case to a headline, to remember only the shock, only the horror. But behind every headline, there is a human story, not to excuse the crime, not to justify the act, but to understand how a person reaches a point where moral boundaries collapse. Crimes like this do not appear suddenly. They build slowly, through isolation, through distorted thinking, through silence. For the villagers, the event changed something permanent. Trust became fragile. Routine felt different. Even the cemetery, once a quiet place of reflection, carried a different weight. When something sacred is violated, the psychological impact lingers longer than the legal process. People begin to question safety, not just physical safety, but moral safety. This case also reminds us of something uncomfortable, that extreme behavior often grows in environments where warning signs are overlooked, where mental health conversations are avoided, where stigma prevents intervention. Across the world, not just in Indonesia, communities continue to struggle with recognizing vulnerability before it turns into crisis, and sometimes the cost of ignoring it becomes national news. More than 2 decades later, the name Sumanto still carries weight. For some, it represents fear. For others, it represents a failure of awareness. But perhaps the deeper lesson is this: society often reacts loudly after a tragedy, but prevention requires quiet attention long before one, because the most unsettling cases are not only about what happened, they are about what could have been prevented, and about the questions that remain long after the headlines fade.